David looked at his watch for the third time in 2 minutes. He was already 15 minutes behind schedule, and the traffic wasn't doing him any favors. 3 months. That's how long he'd been out of work, watching his savings account shrink week by week while sending out dozens of applications that went nowhere. And today, finally, he had a real shot at getting back on his feet. The architecture firm downtown was one of the biggest in the city. They designed those fancy office buildings you see in magazines, the kind with glass walls and names you actually recognize. His interview was in 40 minutes, and he still needed to grab the portfolio he'd accidentally left in his car that morning. He'd been at the hospital visiting his dad, who was recovering from a minor surgery, and in his rush to get back home and prepare, he'd left his most important documents sitting in the back seat. The hospital parking garage was dimly lit and nearly empty at this hour. Most people were either inside visiting or had already left for the day. David's footsteps echoed as he walked quickly toward his car, mentally rehearsing the answers to questions they might ask him. What's your greatest strength? Why did you leave your last position? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? That's when he saw her. An older woman, probably in her 70s, stood next to a silver sedan with grocery bags scattered around her feet. Her walker had tipped over and she was bent at an awkward angle, trying to pick up cans that had rolled under the car. Even from a distance, David could see her hands shaking. He slowed his pace. His car was just 3 spots away. He could see his portfolio sitting right there on the back seat, exactly where he'd left it. All he had to do was grab it and go. The interview, his future, everything he'd been working toward was waiting for him downtown. But the woman was struggling. Really struggling. She'd managed to grab 1 can, but when she tried to stand up straight, she wobbled and had to grab the car door to steady herself. A small sound escaped her, something between frustration and defeat. David's feet stopped moving. He stood there caught between 2 choices, both pulling at him with equal force. Every logical part of his brain was screaming at him to keep walking. This wasn't his problem. Someone else would come along. The hospital had staff for this kind of thing. He'd worked so hard to get this interview. 3 months of rejection and waiting and hoping had led to this one opportunity. But his mom had raised him better than that. He could practically hear her voice in his head, the same tone she'd used when he was a kid and tried to ignore someone who needed help. We don't walk past people, David. We don't pretend we don't see them. He took a breath and changed direction. Excuse me, ma'am. Can I help you with those? The woman looked up and David saw tears on her cheeks. She quickly tried to wipe them away, embarrassed. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm making such a mess. I thought I could manage, but everything just... It's okay, David said, already picking up the walker and setting it upright. Let me get these bags for you. He gathered the scattered groceries, checking each item to make sure nothing was damaged. Bread, milk, some canned soup, bananas, tea bags. Basic stuff. The kind of shopping trip that shouldn't have been this hard. As he worked, the woman introduced herself as Helen. Her voice was soft, worn out. My daughter was supposed to pick me up, Helen explained, steadying herself with the walker. I just got discharged a couple hours ago. Nothing serious, just a small procedure. But Linda called 20 minutes ago. Her son fell at school and broke his arm. She's at the emergency room with him right now. David loaded the last bag into her trunk. Is someone else coming to get you? Helen shook her head. Linda's my only child, and she lives 40 minutes away even without traffic. My neighbors are all at work. I called a taxi, but they said it would be at least an hour, maybe more. I thought I'd wait in my car, but then I realized I hadn't eaten since breakfast and felt dizzy. So I went to the cafeteria and got a few things. And now? She gestured helplessly at the car. The walker herself. David checked his watch again. 28 minutes until his interview. If he left right now, he might make it. Traffic would be bad, but if he pushed it, if the lights were in his favor, he could walk in right on time. Professional, prepared, ready to impress. He looked at Helen, really looked at her. She was trying so hard to hold it together, but he could see she was exhausted, scared even. The kind of scared that comes when you're alone and hurting and wondering how you're going to get through something that should have been simple. Where do you live? David asked. Oh, you don't have to. I couldn't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. Where do you live? Helen gave him an address. David pulled out his phone and typed it into his map app. 18 minutes away in current traffic, plus time to help her inside, plus time to drive back. He'd never make the interview on time. He wouldn't even make it at all. Not if he wanted to actually help this woman the way she needed helping. He made the call before he could talk himself out of it. Hello? Yes. This is David Torres. I have an interview scheduled with Mr. Richardson at 3 o'clock today. His voice was steady, even though his heart was pounding. I'm afraid I need to reschedule. Something urgent has come up. I apologize for the inconvenience. The receptionist sounded surprised but professional. She said she'd pass along the message and someone would call him back. David knew what that meant. In a competitive job market, missing an interview was basically taking yourself out of the running. There were probably 10 other candidates who showed up on time, portfolio in hand, ready to say all the right things. He hung up and turned to Helen. Okay, let's get you home. The drive took longer than expected. Helen insisted on giving him directions instead of trusting the GPS, which added a few wrong turns to the journey. But she talked the whole way, and David found himself actually listening instead of just being polite. She told him about her late husband, George, who'd been a teacher, about her garden, which she couldn't maintain the way she used to, about Linda, who was trying so hard to take care of everyone and was spreading herself too thin. You must think I'm a silly old woman, Helen said at one point. Going on and on like this? Not at all, David replied, and he meant it. There was something about Helen's voice, the way she talked about her life, that made everything feel real and important. Not the fake important of job interviews and impressing people, but the real important of actually living and connecting with another human being. When they got to Helen's house, a small but well-kept place with flower pots on the porch, David didn't just drop the bags at the door. He helped her inside, put the groceries away where she directed, and filled a glass of water for her. He even checked to make sure she had her phone nearby and her medications within reach. You're going to be okay? He asked. I'm going to be fine, Helen said. She was sitting in a comfortable chair now, looking much better than she had in that parking garage. Thanks to you. I don't know how to repay such kindness. You don't need to repay anything, but Helen was already reaching into her purse. She pulled out a small business card and pressed it into David's hand. Please, she said. Take this. You might need it someday. David glanced at the card. A name, a phone number, nothing else. He didn't recognize the name, but something in Helen's expression told him this was important to her, so he tucked it into his wallet. Thank you, Helen said again, her eyes bright. You gave up something important today to help me. I could see it on your face. That kind of character, it means something. Don't forget that. David drove home slowly, reality sinking in. He'd missed his one good opportunity. His girlfriend was going to be furious when she found out. His bank account was dangerously low. He'd just thrown away his chance at stability for a stranger in a parking garage. But as he walked into his apartment and saw his interview clothes hanging ready, unused, he couldn't quite bring himself to regret it. Helen had needed help, real help, and he'd been there to give it. Sometimes he thought that just had to be enough. He didn't know yet that this decision would change everything, that the card in his wallet would open a door he didn't even know existed, that his tomorrow was already waiting for him, just not in the place he'd been looking. All he knew was that he'd done the right thing, even when it cost him something. And for that one moment, sitting in his quiet apartment with an uncertain future ahead, that was enough. The call came 2 days later. David had been checking his phone obsessively, hoping for good news, but deep down he already knew what the voice on the other end would say. Mr. Torres, thank you for your interest in our firm. Unfortunately, we've decided to move forward with other candidates. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. Professional, polite, final. David thanked the woman and hung up. He sat on his couch staring at nothing, feeling the weight of his choice settle over him like a heavy blanket. He'd done the right thing, he kept telling himself. Helen had needed help. But doing the right thing didn't pay rent. It didn't put food on the table or stop the collection calls that were starting to come in more frequently. His girlfriend, Rachel, didn't try to hide her frustration when he told her what had happened. You did what? She was standing in his kitchen, arms crossed, staring at him like he'd lost his mind. You skipped a job interview to help some random old lady with her groceries? She wasn't just some random person, David said, though his voice lacked conviction. She was alone and had just gotten out of the hospital, and her daughter couldn't make it. What was I supposed to do, just walk past her? Yes! Rachel threw her hands up. Yes, David, that's exactly what you were supposed to do. Call hospital security. Call her a ride service. Do literally anything except throw away your career for someone you don't even know. They'd been dating for 2 years. Rachel was practical, ambitious, always thinking 3 steps ahead. It was one of the things David had admired about her when they first met. She had a plan and she stuck to it. But lately that same quality felt less like strength and more like coldness. This was your shot, Rachel continued. 3 months you've been out of work. 3 months I've been covering most of our dates, most of the groceries when you come over. I've been patient, but you can't keep doing this. You can't keep choosing everyone else over your own life. It was one time, David said quietly. It's never just one time with you. Rachel's voice softened slightly, but the disappointment didn't leave her eyes. You're a good person, David, maybe too good. But being good doesn't matter if you can't take care of yourself. If you can't think about our future. The words hung in the air between them. David wanted to say something, to defend himself, to make her understand why he couldn't have just walked away. But what could he say? She wasn't wrong about the facts. He had thrown away an opportunity. He was broke. He had made a choice that on paper looked completely irrational. Rachel left that night and something between them left with her. They didn't break up officially, not yet, but David could feel the relationship cracking like ice under too much weight. The next few weeks were brutal. David sent out applications to every firm he could find. He lowered his standards, applying for jobs he was overqualified for, jobs that paid barely enough to scrape by. Most never responded. The few that did sent polite rejections or wanted someone with experience in areas he'd never worked in. His savings account hit double digits, then single digits. He started skipping meals to make his groceries last longer. He canceled his streaming subscriptions, his gym membership, anything that wasn't absolutely essential. His landlord sent him a warning about late rent. The power company threatened to shut off his electricity. To keep himself afloat, David took whatever work he could find. He signed up for a delivery app, driving other people's food around the city in his beat-up Honda. He picked up freelance drafting work online, little projects that paid $50 or $100 for hours of detailed work. He helped a friend move apartments for $200 cash. Every dollar counted. Every day was about survival. Rachel's calls became less frequent. Their conversations became shorter. She was busy with her own job, her own life. David could hear the distance growing between them with every awkward silence. One night, she suggested they take a break to figure things out. David agreed because he didn't have the energy to fight for something that already felt lost. 4 months after the parking garage, Rachel came over to his apartment one last time. She walked in, looked around at the place he'd been too depressed to clean properly inside. I can't do this anymore, she said simply. I've tried to be supportive. I've tried to understand. But you're not trying to fix your life, David. You're just existing, surviving, and I can't wait around hoping you'll get it together. I'm trying, David said, hating how weak his voice sounded. No, you're accepting. There's a difference. Rachel set her keys to his apartment on the counter. I need to be with someone who fights for what they want. Someone who puts themselves first sometimes. You're so busy being a good person that you've forgotten how to be a strong one. She left, and this time David knew she wasn't coming back. He sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by overdue bills and rejection emails, and wondered if she was right. Maybe he was too soft. Maybe his mom's lessons about helping people had left him unprepared for a world that didn't reward kindness. Maybe that day in the parking garage had been the biggest mistake of his life. Late one night, David was sitting at his kitchen table, counting the cash he'd made from deliveries that week. $83. Not even enough to cover groceries and gas. He opened his wallet to organize his few remaining bills, and a small business card fell out onto the table. He'd forgotten all about it. The card Helen had given him, pressed into his hand like some kind of talisman. He picked it up and looked at it for the first time since that day. A name, Victoria Park, a phone number, nothing else. No company name, no title, no context. Curious, despite his exhaustion, David pulled out his phone and typed the name into a search engine. The results loaded and his breath caught in his chest. Victoria Park wasn't just anyone. She was the founder and director of Park & Associates, a mid-size architecture firm that specialized in sustainable design and community projects. David had heard of them, had even admired their work when he was in school. They designed affordable housing complexes, community centers, public spaces that actually served people, instead of just looking impressive. Their projects won awards not for being flashy, but for being meaningful. David clicked through their website, looking at images of buildings that felt alive and human. There was a recreation center in a low-income neighborhood, a housing development designed to use half the energy of traditional buildings, a public library that doubled as a community hub. This was the kind of work he'd dreamed of doing back when he first decided to become an architect, before the practical concerns of paying bills and building a career had narrowed his vision. He stared at the business card. Why would Helen have this? What connection did she have to Victoria Park? It was almost midnight, way too late to call anyone, but David couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Helen, about the card, about the way she'd looked at him so intently when she said, "You might need it someday." Like she knew something he didn't, like she was seeing a future he couldn't see yet. The next morning, David made coffee and paced around his apartment for an hour, building up courage. What would he even say? "Hi, I helped an old woman 4 months ago and she gave me your number." It sounded insane, but what did he have to lose at this point? He was broke, single, facing eviction, and running out of options fast. He dialed before he could change his mind. The phone rang twice before a warm, professional voice answered. Victoria Park speaking. David's prepared speech evaporated from his mind. "Hi, Ms. Park, my name is David Torres. I know this is going to sound strange, but I received your card from a woman named Helen a few months ago, and I'm not sure why I'm calling, honestly." There was a pause. Then, unexpectedly, Victoria laughed. Not a mocking laugh, but something warm and genuine. "Helen is my mother, and if she gave you her card, I'm guessing you did something kind for her. Am I right? I helped her with some groceries. It wasn't a big deal. It was to her." Victoria's voice changed, becoming more serious. "She called me that day. Told me about a young man who missed something important to help her get home safely. She was quite taken with you. Said you were the kind of person who sees people, not obstacles." David didn't know what to say to that. He felt a lump forming in his throat, a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. "Do you work in architecture?" Victoria asked. "Helen mentioned you had been on your way to an interview." "I'm an architect, yes. Or I was. I've been between positions for a while now. Do you have a portfolio?" David's heart started beating faster. "Yes, I have a portfolio. Can you come in Friday morning? Say 10 o'clock? I'd like to see your work. No promises, but I'm always interested in meeting people my mother thinks are worth meeting, and her instincts about character are usually spot on." David agreed, gave her his email for the address, and hung up in a state of shock. He had an interview, a real one, at a firm he actually respected, because of a card he'd almost thrown away, because of a choice he'd made in a parking garage when everything in his life had been falling apart. He looked around his messy apartment, at the bills, and the emptiness, and the evidence of his struggle. Maybe Rachel had been wrong. Maybe choosing to help someone when it cost him something hadn't been weakness. Maybe it had been the strongest thing he'd ever done. He wouldn't know for sure until Friday. But for the first time in months, David felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. David spent the next 3 days preparing like his life depended on it. Because in many ways it did. He updated his portfolio, printed fresh copies on the good paper he'd been saving, and practiced talking about his work until the words felt natural instead of rehearsed. He got his one decent suit dry cleaned with the last bit of money from his delivery earnings. He wanted to make a good impression, to show Victoria Park that her mother's faith in him hadn't been misplaced. Friday morning arrived cold and clear. David left early, giving himself plenty of time to find the office and calm his nerves. Park & Associates was located in a converted warehouse in an older part of downtown, the kind of neighborhood that had been industrial once and was now transforming into something new. The building itself was beautiful in an understated way, with large windows, exposed brick, and solar panels on the roof. Inside, the space was nothing like the corporate firm where he'd interviewed months ago. Instead of sterile white walls and glass conference rooms, there were plants everywhere. Actual trees growing in large planters, desks made from reclaimed wood, models of buildings scattered throughout the space, each one telling a story about community and sustainability. Natural light poured in through skylights, and David could hear people talking and laughing somewhere deeper in the office. It felt alive. It felt like a place where people actually wanted to work. A young man at the reception desk smiled at him. "David Torres, Victoria's expecting you. Follow me." They walked through the open workspace, past architects hunched over drafting tables and having animated discussions about load-bearing walls and solar orientation. David felt a pang of longing. This was what he'd imagined his career would look like when he first graduated. Not the corporate ladder climbing, but this, creating things that mattered with people who cared. Victoria's office was at the back, with windows overlooking a small courtyard garden. She stood when David entered, a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun. She had Helen's kind eyes, but there was a sharpness there too, an intelligence that missed nothing. "David," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." They spent the next hour going through his portfolio. Victoria asked pointed questions about every project, wanting to know not just what he'd designed, but why. What problems was he trying to solve? Who would use these spaces? What had he learned from his mistakes? David answered as honestly as he could. He talked about his time at the corporate firm, designing office buildings that looked impressive but felt cold. He admitted that he'd gotten lost somewhere along the way, focused more on pleasing clients and advancing his career than on creating spaces that improved people's lives. He showed her some personal projects he'd worked on during his unemployment, small community concepts he'd developed just to keep his skills sharp. A neighborhood playground, a homeless shelter redesign, things that would never make him money but felt important anyway. Victoria listened intently, occasionally nodding or making notes. When they finished, she closed the portfolio and looked at him directly. "Tell me about the day you met my mother." David had been expecting questions about software proficiency or project management experience. This caught him off guard. "I'm not sure what you want to know." "Everything," Victoria said. "Helen told me her version, but I want to hear yours. Why did you stop?" So David told her. About being late for the interview, about seeing Helen struggling, about the voice in his head that sounded like his mother telling him not to walk past people, about making the call to reschedule, knowing it probably meant losing the opportunity, about the drive to Helen's house and helping her get settled, even though every minute meant his chances were slipping away. "I don't know if it was the right choice professionally," David admitted. "It's cost me a lot. My girlfriend left me because she thought I was being stupid. Maybe she was right. But I couldn't just not help. Does that make sense?" Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "It makes perfect sense. In fact, it's exactly the answer I was hoping for." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard. "My mother has given out her card 5 times in the last 10 years. She only does it when she meets someone who demonstrates real character, someone who chooses kindness when it costs them something. Out of those 5 people, you're the second one who actually called." David wasn't sure what to say to that. "We built this firm on a simple principle," Victoria continued. "Architecture isn't just about buildings. It's about people. The people who will live and work and play in the spaces we create. If you can't see the humanity in what you're doing, you can't do this work well." "Not really." She turned back to face him. "What you did for my mother that day, that's the kind of seeing we need. The ability to recognize when something matters more than your own convenience." She returned to her desk and opened a folder. "We're working on a community wellness center right now. It's going into a neighborhood that's been overlooked for decades. The building needs to serve multiple purposes: healthcare access, fitness facilities, community meeting spaces, mental health services. It needs to be welcoming, efficient, and affordable to maintain. It's complicated work and it's not glamorous. But it's important." David leaned forward, his heart racing. "It sounds incredible. We need someone who can handle the technical side while keeping the human element front and center. Someone who understands that we're not just designing a building. We're designing a space where people's lives might genuinely improve." Victoria looked at him steadily. "The pay isn't what you'd make at a big corporate firm. The hours can be long, and you'll have to prove yourself, because we're taking a chance based on my mother's instinct and 1 hour of conversation. But if you're interested, I'd like to offer you a position as a junior architect on this project." For a moment, David couldn't breathe. After months of rejection, of struggle, of wondering if he'd made the worst decision of his life in that parking garage, someone was offering him not just a job, but the kind of work he'd dreamed about. "I'm interested," he managed to say. "I'm very interested." They spent the next hour discussing details. The salary was modest, but it was enough to live on, enough to start rebuilding. The project timeline, the team he'd be working with, the software they used, Victoria introduced him to some of the other architects, and David felt an immediate connection with their energy and passion. These were people who cared about their work for the right reasons. As David was leaving, Victoria walked him to the door. "My mother told me something after she met you," she said. "She said you were already the person you needed to be. You just needed the right place to become yourself." I think she might be right. David drove home in a daze. He sat in his car outside his apartment building for 10 minutes, just processing what had happened. He had a job. Not just any job, but meaningful work with people who valued the same things he did. The door that had slammed shut 4 months ago had been replaced by a different door, one that opened onto a path he'd never even known existed. He thought about Helen, about that moment in the parking garage when he'd made a choice that seemed to cost him everything. And now it turned out that choice had been an investment, a seed planted that had been growing in darkness all this time, waiting for the right moment to break through the soil. David pulled out his phone and scrolled to Rachel's number. He almost called her to share the news, but something stopped him. This wasn't about proving her wrong or showing her he'd made it. This was about moving forward into something new, something that felt right in a way nothing had felt right in a long time. Instead, he called his mom. She answered on the second ring, and before she could even say hello properly, David said, "You were right." "About what, honey?" "About not walking past people. About seeing them." David felt his voice crack slightly. "I got the job. The one I told you about. Because I stopped to help someone 4 months ago, and it turned out to be exactly what I needed to do." His mom was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm proud of you. Not because you got the job, but because you were the kind of person who stopped. The job is just the world recognizing what I already knew." That night, David cleaned his apartment for the first time in weeks. He paid his overdue rent. He bought actual groceries instead of the cheapest things he could find. And before he went to bed, he took out a piece of paper and wrote a letter to Helen, thanking her for seeing something in him he hadn't been able to see in himself. He didn't know yet about the woman he'd meet on this new path, or the life he'd build, or how this job would transform not just his career, but his entire understanding of what success meant. He didn't know that his tomorrow had been waiting all along. Not in the place he'd been looking, but in a moment of simple human kindness. All he knew was that he'd made a choice that felt impossible at the time. And somehow, in ways he couldn't have predicted, it had turned out to be the best decision of his life. The door had closed, but a window had opened. And through that window, David could finally see the future he was meant to have. The first few months at Park & Associates felt like drinking water after crossing a desert. David threw himself into the Wellness Center project with an intensity that surprised even him. He arrived early and stayed late, not because anyone asked him to, but because he genuinely wanted to be there. For the first time in his career, Monday mornings didn't fill him with dread. The project itself was complex. The Wellness Center needed to serve a neighborhood that had been systematically neglected for decades. Limited public transportation, few healthy food options, minimal access to health care. The building they were designing had to be more than just a structure. It had to be an anchor point for community transformation. David's role started small. He worked on technical drawings, calculated load requirements, researched sustainable materials. But Victoria noticed his attention to detail and his genuine interest in the community impact. She started including him in bigger decisions. How should they orient the building to maximize natural light? What materials would be both affordable and durable? How could they design spaces that felt welcoming rather than institutional? 6 months into the job, Victoria called David into her office. "We're starting a new project," she said, pulling up plans on her computer. "Affordable housing, 15 units for families transitioning out of difficult situations. It's a partnership with several social service organizations." She looked at him carefully. "I want you to lead it." David felt his stomach drop. "Lead it? I've only been here 6 months, which means you still remember what it's like to struggle," Victoria said. "You understand what it means to need help and to feel like the world isn't designed for people like you. That perspective matters for a project like this." She smiled. "Besides, you're ready. I wouldn't offer if you weren't." The affordable housing project terrified and excited David in equal measure. This was real leadership, real responsibility. If he messed up, it wouldn't just affect his career. It would affect real families who needed safe, stable homes. The first community input meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at a local church. David prepared obsessively, creating detailed presentations and rehearsing answers to potential questions. He wanted the community to know he took this seriously, that their input mattered. About 30 people showed up. Families with young kids, single parents, a few elderly residents who'd lived in the neighborhood their whole lives, and social workers, including one woman who stood out immediately. She was probably in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that seemed to notice everything. When she spoke, her voice was clear and confident. "My name is Lauren, and I work with families experiencing housing insecurity. I've seen too many affordable housing projects that look good on paper but don't actually serve the people who live in them." She looked directly at David. "So I need to know, are you actually listening? Or is this just checking a box?" David appreciated her directness. "I'm listening. That's why we're here. This building needs to work for the people who live in it, not just meet code requirements or look good in a portfolio." They spent the next 2 hours going through every aspect of the design. Lauren and others from the community pointed out things David hadn't considered. The importance of having enough storage space because people who'd experienced housing insecurity often needed room for belongings they'd held onto through hard times. The need for good soundproofing between units to give families privacy and dignity. The value of outdoor space where kids could play and adults could garden. David took notes furiously, his mind already redesigning elements to incorporate their feedback. This was what architecture should be, he realized. Not one person's vision imposed on a community, but a collaboration that actually served people's needs. After the meeting, Lauren approached him. "You really were listening," she said, sounding slightly surprised. "Of course. You know what these families need better than I ever could. You'd be surprised how rare that attitude is." Lauren handed him her card. "I have some additional thoughts about the community space design. Would you be willing to meet and go over them?" They met for coffee 3 days later. What was supposed to be a 1-hour meeting turned into 3. Lauren had insights about everything from the optimal size of kitchen spaces to the psychological impact of natural light on mental health. She'd worked with dozens of families over the years and had seen firsthand what made the difference between housing that just sheltered people and housing that actually helped them heal and rebuild. More than that, she was passionate about her work in a way that reminded David of his own team at Park & Associates. She'd chosen a demanding, emotionally difficult career that didn't pay well because it aligned with her values. She understood sacrifice. She understood choosing people over convenience. They started meeting regularly to refine the housing project. Professional meetings that somehow always ran long. Conversations that drifted from building design to philosophy to personal stories. David learned that Lauren had a 7-year-old daughter named Chloe. She'd been a single mom since Chloe was 2, when her ex-husband decided fatherhood wasn't for him and left. She'd been balancing work, parenting, and graduate school ever since, determined to create a better world for families like hers. "That's why this project matters so much," Lauren said during one of their meetings. "I've been one missed paycheck away from housing insecurity. I know how quickly everything can fall apart, and I know how much having a stable, safe place to live changes everything." David found himself looking forward to their meetings more than anything else in his week. Lauren challenged him, pushed him to think deeper about every decision. But she also understood him in a way Rachel never had. When he told her the story of how he'd gotten his job, about stopping to help Helen and missing his interview, she didn't look at him like he was naive. "Of course you stopped," she said simply. "That's who you are. Anyone who wouldn't stop isn't someone I'd trust to design housing for vulnerable families." 8 months into working together, David invited Lauren to see the completed wellness center. The building had officially opened the week before, and he wanted to show her what they'd accomplished. They walked through the bright, welcoming spaces together. The healthcare clinic with its warm colors and comfortable waiting area, the fitness center with equipment and classes accessible to all ability levels, the community rooms where neighborhood groups were already scheduling meetings. "This is what you do," Lauren said, looking around. "You create spaces that treat people with dignity. That's what I'm trying to do with your project, too." "It's not my project," Lauren corrected. "It's our project." Something in the way she said "our" made David's heart beat faster. He realized with sudden clarity that his feelings for Lauren had shifted somewhere along the way from professional respect to something deeper. but she had enough on her plate raising Chloe and doing her demanding work. The last thing she needed was complicated romantic feelings from a colleague. A few weeks later, Lauren invited David to Chloe's school art show. "She's been working on a painting about home," Lauren explained. "And she's talked so much about the building project. She even drew some pictures of it. I thought you might want to see them." David met them at the school that evening. Chloe was a bright, energetic kid who'd inherited her mother's fierce intelligence. Her painting showed a colorful building with big windows and happy families. When David complimented it, she beamed. "Mom says you're making a place where families can be safe," Chloe said. "That's the most important kind of building." After the art show, they went for pizza. David and Chloe bonded over their shared love of architecture, though Chloe's interest leaned more toward designing castles and treehouses. Lauren watched them interact with a soft smile on her face. Walking back to their cars later, Chloe running ahead to look at a store window display, Lauren said quietly, "You're good with her. She's a great kid. You're doing an amazing job." "It's hard sometimes," Lauren admitted, being the only parent, the only person responsible for everything. "Wondering if you're doing enough, if you're making the right choices." She paused, "But then I remember that I'm modeling something important for her. That you don't have to choose between having integrity and having a life. That you can build something real if you're willing to work for it." David thought about his own journey, the corporate job that had felt hollow, the relationship with Rachel that had been built on practicality rather than shared values, the moment in a parking garage that had seemed like the end of everything but had actually been the beginning. "Building something real," he repeated. "Yeah, that's what matters." They stood there in the parking lot watching Chloe press her hands against the store window, pointing at something inside. The evening was cool, the streetlights just starting to flicker on. And David realized that he was happier in this moment than he'd been in years, not because everything was perfect, but because everything felt true. He didn't know yet that he'd found his future standing in that parking lot. That Lauren and Chloe would become his family. That the affordable housing project would win awards and lead to more opportunities. That he'd look back on this time as the point when his life finally aligned with who he actually was. All he knew was that he'd stopped in a parking garage for a stranger, and somehow that choice had led him here. To meaningful work, to genuine connections, to a life built on values instead of convenience. The door had closed. The window had opened, and now David was finally learning to see what had been waiting for him all along. 2 years after David started working at Park & Associates, he stood in front of the completed affordable housing complex on a crisp autumn morning, watching families move into their new homes. The building looked even better than he'd imagined during all those late nights of revisions and planning. 3 stories of warm brick and large windows, a central courtyard with raised garden beds, solar panels on the roof, bright, welcoming entranceways that said "You belong here" instead of "You're receiving charity." But more than how it looked, David was proud of how it felt. He'd walked through the units a dozen times during construction, checking every detail. The storage closets were bigger than standard, because Lauren had insisted families needed space for their belongings and memories. The kitchens had real counter space and good appliances, because people deserved to cook real meals for their families. Each unit had at least one window that caught morning light because waking up to sunshine mattered. Every decision had been made with actual human beings in mind, not just code requirements or budget lines. Lauren stood next to him, clipboard in hand, coordinating with the social workers helping families move in. Chloe was there too, now 9 years old, handing out welcome packages with her characteristic enthusiasm. David watched them work together, this team of 2 who'd been managing on their own for so long, and felt that familiar warmth in his chest. His relationship with Lauren had developed slowly, carefully over months of working together and gradually becoming part of each other's lives. There'd been no dramatic moment, no big confession, just a growing realization that they fit together in all the ways that mattered. They understood each other's work, shared the same values, and genuinely liked spending time together. Lauren had been cautious at first, protective of Chloe, and worried about bringing someone new into their tight unit of 2. But David had been patient, letting the relationship develop at its own pace. Now, standing here watching Lauren coordinate move-ins with practiced efficiency, while Chloe charmed everyone she talked to, David couldn't imagine his life without them. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was scheduled for early afternoon. Local officials would say nice things about community development and public-private partnerships. Victoria would give a speech about sustainable design and social responsibility. But the real moment David was waiting for was seeing the families actually living here, making these spaces their own. A van pulled up, and Victoria stepped out, followed by someone who made David's breath catch. Helen. She was moving slowly, still using her walker, but her eyes were bright and her smile was huge. David hurried over to help her out of the van. "Helen, I didn't know you were coming." "And miss this?" "Not a chance." She patted his arm affectionately. "Victoria told me about the project. I wanted to see what came from that day in the parking garage." They'd stayed in touch over the past 2 years. David visited Helen every few months, usually bringing her updates about the projects he was working on. She'd become something like an adoptive grandmother to him, someone who believed in him with a fierceness that still surprised him sometimes. The ceremony began promptly at 1 o'clock. The mayor spoke about economic development. The director of social services talked about the housing crisis. Victoria gave a beautiful speech about architecture that serves humanity, rather than just ego, and then unexpectedly she invited David to say a few words. He hadn't prepared anything. David walked up to the small podium set up in the courtyard, looking out at the assembled crowd. City officials in suits, social workers who'd partnered on the project, families who'd be living here, some holding small children, all looking at him with a mix of hope and cautious optimism that he recognized from his own life not so long ago. 2 years ago, David began, his voice a little shaky. "I didn't work here. I was broke, unemployed, and pretty sure I'd made the worst decision of my life." He found Helen in the crowd, sitting in a chair Victoria had brought for her. "I'd missed a job interview to help someone who needed help, and I thought that choice had cost me everything." He paused, gathering his thoughts. But what I didn't understand then was that some choices aren't about immediate outcomes. They're about who you are and who you want to be. When I stopped to help Helen that day, I wasn't thinking about my career or my future. I was just thinking that someone needed help and I could give it. Lauren was watching him with that expression that always made his heart feel too big for his chest. Chloe was sitting cross-legged at her mother's feet, listening intently. "This building exists because of that choice," David continued. "Not directly, but because that choice led me here, to this team, to this work, to these partnerships. And more importantly, it reminded me that architecture isn't really about buildings. It's about people, about creating spaces where people can live with dignity and hope, where families can start over and build something better." He gestured to the building behind him. 30 families are moving in today. 30 families who've been through hard times and are looking for a fresh start. This building won't solve all their problems, but it'll give them a foundation. A safe place to come home to. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. The applause was warm, but David barely heard it. He was thinking about his own fresh start, his own foundation that had been built from a moment of kindness in a parking garage. After the ceremony, while families continued moving in and officials mingled over coffee and cookies, Helen pulled David aside. They sat together on a bench in the courtyard, watching Chloe show some of the younger kids where the garden beds were. "I want to tell you something," Helen said. "Something I haven't told many people." She was quiet for a moment, watching the activity around them. "When I was young, during the civil rights movement, I was an activist. Nothing famous, nothing that made the history books. But I believed that small acts of kindness and courage could change the world. That how we treat each other in individual moments matters just as much as big policies and grand gestures." She turned to look at David directly. "I've given out my daughter's card to 5 people over the years. People I saw make choices that cost them something. Choices made because they valued human dignity over their own convenience. You're the second person who actually called, the only one who turned it into something like this." "Why did you do it?" David asked. "Give out the cards, I mean." "Because I believe in planting seeds," Helen said simply. "I'm old now. I can't march or protest or change the world the way I used to. But I can recognize good people when I see them. And I can try to connect them with opportunities to do good work. That's my small act now." David felt tears prick his eyes. "You changed my life." "No," Helen corrected gently. "You were already the person you needed to be. I just helped you find the right place to be that person." She smiled. "And you've changed more lives than you realize." Those 30 families. The workers you've mentored. Lauren and Chloe. At the mention of their names, David looked over to where Lauren was helping a family carry boxes inside. Chloe running ahead to hold the door open. His family now in all the ways that mattered. I need to tell you something too, David said. I'm going to ask Lauren to marry me. I wanted you to know before I did it. Helen's face lit up. Oh, David, that's wonderful. She's perfect for you, and Chloe is lucky to have you as her father. I'm the lucky one, David said. All of this, everything good in my life right now, it came from that one moment. From choosing to stop when it would have been easier to keep going. Helen patted his hand. That's the thing about kindness. You never know where it'll lead. But it always leads somewhere better than the path of looking away. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching people move through the space David had designed. Families laughing, workers helping, community members welcoming their new neighbors. Life happening in a building that existed because of a chain of choices that started with helping an elderly woman with her groceries. Later that evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the sun was setting golden over the courtyard, David walked through the building one more time. He ran his hand along the walls, checked the fixtures, looked out the windows at the view residents would wake up to each morning. In one unit, he could hear a child laughing. In another, someone was already cooking dinner, the smell of garlic and onions drifting into the hallway. This was success, David realized. Not the corner office or the fancy title or the big salary he'd been chasing at that corporate firm 2 years ago. This. Creating something that improved people's lives. Being part of a community. Having work that aligned with his values. Coming home to people who loved him for who he actually was, not who they wanted him to be. His phone buzzed with a text from Lauren. Chloe wants to know if you're coming over for dinner. I want to know the same thing. David smiled and typed back. On my way. As he walked to his car, he thought about the path that had brought him here. The interview he'd missed. The relationship that had ended. The months of struggle and doubt. The business card that had seemed like nothing. Each piece had been necessary, each choice had mattered, even the painful ones. He'd stayed to help a stranger when everything in his life told him to keep moving. And that stranger had seen something in him worth nurturing. She'd planted a seed. And now, 2 years later, David was standing in the shade of the tree that had grown from it, surrounded by people he loved and work that mattered, and a future that felt right in every way.